Have you ever wondered why someone can walk away from you but still somehow never fully disappear from your life? Why do they leave in silence, act distant, and seem emotionally gone only to reappear later as if nothing inside them ever truly shut down? And more importantly, why does it feel like you are the only one who is trying to make sense of something they themselves don't even understand? Because here is the truth most people never get told. Some people don't leave because they stopped caring. They leave because caring too much feels unsafe to them. And once you understand this one psychological truth, everything about their behavior starts to make sense in a completely different way. Before we go deeper, stay with this all the way to the end, because what you are about to learn is not just about why avoidant people come back. It is about what actually makes them stay for good. And most people destroy that chance without even realizing it. Now let's go deeper into something most people misread completely. When someone with an avoidant emotional pattern enters your life, the beginning often feels calm, even controlled. They may seem strong, independent, emotionally stable. They don't rush, they don't cling, and that can feel refreshing at first. But underneath that calm surface, something very different is happening. Avoidant individuals are not disconnected from emotion. In fact, they often feel things deeply, sometimes even more deeply than others, but their nervous system interprets emotional closeness differently. For them, closeness doesn't always feel like comfort. It can feel like pressure, like loss of control, like emotional overwhelm they don't know how to manage. So instead of leaning in when things get intense, they pull back. Not because they don't care, but because their mind is trying to protect them from what feels like emotional danger. And this is where the first misunderstanding begins. To you, their distance feels like rejection, but to them, their distance feels like survival. This is the psychology of emotional avoidance. It is not a lack of attachment, it is an overactivation of self-protection. And here is where things become even more confusing, because when they pull away, most people assume the connection is over. They think silence means the bond is broken. They think distance means indifference. But with avoidant individuals, silence is not the end of emotion. It is often where emotion gets stored instead of expressed. They don't process feelings through closeness, they process them through distance. So when they disappear, their external looks calm, but internally things are still active. Thoughts still exist, memories still linger. Emotional traces do not simply vanish just because communication stops. And this is where the cycle begins. The more intense the emotional connection was, the more likely it is that distance does not erase it. It only delays it because in silence, something subtle happens inside them. The nervous system starts to reset. The emotional intensity drops. The pressure they felt starts to fade. And when that pressure fades, something very interesting begins to happen. They start to remember the connection without fear attached to it. Not the arguments, not the overwhelm, but the emotional comfort that was once there. And this is where most people misread the situation again, because from the outside, it looks like they are moving on. But psychologically, what is actually happening is emotional recalibration. Their system is trying to separate love from pressure, connection from fear, intimacy from loss of control. And during this phase, they don't always reach out. They don't always show signs. In fact, they often appear completely detached. But internally, they are not as far as they seem. And this is exactly what leads to the most misunderstood pattern in relationships involving avoidant individuals. They leave, but they don't fully detach. They distance, but they don't fully disconnect. And because of this, there is always a possibility of return, but not for the reasons people think. They don't come back because they suddenly realize what they lost. They come back when their emotional system no longer perceives danger in the connection. And that difference is everything because love alone is not what pulls them back. Safety does, familiarity does, and the absence of pressure does. This is why understanding the beginning of this cycle is so important, because if you misread their departure, you will also misunderstand their return. And if you misunderstand their return, you will repeat the same emotional patterns that pushed them away in the first place. But there is something deeper happening beneath all of this, something most people never see. Avoidant individuals are often caught in an internal conflict between two forces. One part of them craves connection, and another part fears it. So, when they get too close, fear wins. And when they get too far, longing slowly begins to return. This push and pull is not random. It is psychological conditioning based on emotional safety thresholds. And once you understand that, you stop seeing their behavior as chaos. You start seeing it as a pattern, a predictable emotional system. And that is exactly where everything starts to change, because what comes next in this cycle is not silence forever. It is not permanent disappearance. It is something far more complex. And in the next part, you will understand exactly what happens after they withdraw and why the silence they create is never as final as it seems. Why does someone go completely quiet after feeling something so real? And what is actually happening inside their mind during that silence? Because from the outside, it looks like disinterest. It looks like emotional shutdown. It looks like they have moved on without a second thought. But psychologically, what is happening is far more layered than that. When an avoidant person steps away from emotional closeness, the first phase is not peace, it is not clarity, it is emotional overload reduction. Their system is trying to calm itself down after intensity. And once that intensity lowers, something unexpected begins. They start to think again, not about commitment, not about decisions, but about emotional impressions that were left behind. This is where the second stage begins. It is quiet, slow, and almost invisible from the outside. They are not reaching out, they are not expressing anything, but internally, their mind is processing fragments of connection in a controlled way. This stage is often misunderstood because there are no obvious signs, no emotional messages, no visible attempts to reconnect. But absence of action does not mean absence of thought. In fact, this is the stage where memory becomes selective. Their mind begins to filter experiences differently. The emotional pressure that once made closeness feel overwhelming is no longer active. And without that pressure, memories start to feel lighter, safer, more approachable. And slowly, the emotional bond begins to resurface in a less threatening form. Not as something urgent, but as something familiar. This is important to understand because familiarity is one of the strongest emotional triggers in human psychology. The brain naturally returns to what feels known, especially when fear is no longer attached to it. So, while they appear distant, something internal is shifting. They begin to observe life without the emotional weight they once felt. And in that observation, small emotional gaps start to form. Moments of curiosity appear. Thoughts become less defensive. They do not say anything, but they are no longer fully detached. This is the hidden part most people never see because avoidant individuals rarely process emotion through expression. They process it through mental replay, through silent reflection, through internal comparison. They begin asking themselves questions, even if they never voice them. Was that connection really as intense as it felt? Was the discomfort permanent or just situational? Why does it still come to mind when everything is supposed to be over? These questions are not conscious decisions. They arise naturally when emotional systems start to stabilize, and as this happens, something subtle shifts. The emotional memory of the person they stepped away from starts to separate from the emotional discomfort they once felt. This separation is crucial because now they are no longer associating the connection with pressure alone. They are starting to recall moments without emotional tension attached. And when that happens, curiosity begins to grow. Not strong enough to act immediately, but strong enough to disturb silence. At this stage, they may appear fully occupied with their life. They may seem emotionally unavailable, but internally, they are revisiting emotional snapshots and fragments. And the more time passes, the more those fragments become easier to tolerate. This is where inner conflict begins to build. One part of their mind tells them to stay distant, to avoid repeating emotional discomfort, to maintain control. But another part starts questioning whether distance was actually necessary. This is not a dramatic shift. It is not sudden realization. It is a slow psychological balancing process between fear and attachment. And during this balancing process, emotional resistance weakens slightly. Not enough to change behavior immediately, but enough to open a possibility. This is also the stage where silence starts to feel different. At first, silence was relief. It created space, it reduced emotional pressure, but over time, silence can also become reflective, and reflection brings awareness. Awareness brings comparison, and comparison brings internal tension. They begin to compare emotional neutrality with emotional experience. And even if they do not admit it, emotional experience often feels more meaningful than emotional absence. This does not mean they are ready to return. It simply means the emotional system is no longer fully closed. And this is where many misunderstandings happen. Because from the outside, nothing has changed. There are no messages, no signals, no visible movement, but internally, the door is no longer locked. It is only closed, and a closed door can still be opened under the right conditions. At this point, emotional memory becomes the key driver, not logic, not planning, not intention, memory. The human mind does not easily erase emotional imprint, especially when it was once paired with connection and vulnerability. So, even in silence, emotional traces continue to exist in background processing, and over time, those traces become harder to ignore. They start to appear during quiet moments, during low stimulation periods, during emotional rest. And this is when the possibility of return begins to form naturally, not as action, but as thought. And thought is always the first step before behavior changes. But there is still hesitation because even though curiosity is growing, fear has not disappeared completely. So, instead of direct action, they enter observation mode. They do not engage, they do not commit, they simply monitor emotional safety from a distance. They watch for signs of pressure. They look for emotional intensity. They assess whether returning would recreate the same discomfort they once escaped. And this evaluation determines everything that comes next. Because if fear rises again, they withdraw further. But if fear remains low, something new begins to form. A possibility of reconnection without emotional threat. And this is the point where everything starts to shift toward the next stage. Not because they are ready, but because internal resistance is no longer absolute. And what happens after this silent evaluation phase is where the real turning point begins. What actually makes someone who once disappeared start to reappear again? And why does it often happen when you least expect it? Because after silence becomes familiar, something inside them starts to shift again. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, in a way that even they don't fully notice at first. This is the point where the third stage begins. And this stage is the most misunderstood of all. From the outside, it may look like they are returning out of nowhere, but internally, this is not random. It is a response to emotional recalibration reaching a new level. At this point, the mind is no longer in escape mode. It is no longer focused on distancing or emotional recovery alone. Instead, it starts evaluating emotional neutrality. And emotional neutrality can sometimes feel emptier than emotional intensity. Because even though intensity once felt overwhelming, it also made them feel alive. It created meaning. It created emotional presence. And when that is gone for too long, a different feeling starts to emerge. A subtle form of emptiness that is hard to name. This is where curiosity becomes stronger than resistance, but still not strong enough for full emotional exposure. So, instead of direct reconnection, something more careful happens. They begin testing emotional space, not through deep conversations, not through emotional confession, but through small controlled contact that carries no pressure. A simple message, a casual interaction, a low-risk approach to see if the emotional environment has changed. This is not about reunion yet. It is about safety confirmation. Because in their internal system, safety always comes before attachment can re-enter. And this is what most people fail to understand. When they come back, they are not returning to the relationship itself. They are returning to the feeling of whether the relationship feels safe again. And that difference determines everything. At this stage, they are highly sensitive to emotional tone. They are not looking for perfection. They are looking for stability. If the emotional response they receive feels heavy, demanding, or reactive, their system immediately interprets it as risk. And risk leads to withdrawal again. But if the response feels calm, grounded, and emotionally steady, something different happens. Their defenses begin to soften, not because fear disappears completely, but because it no longer feels activated. And when fear is not triggered, connection becomes possible again. This is where internal hesitation begins to reduce, but it does not disappear entirely. Instead, it transforms into observation. They start paying attention not just to what is said, but how it is said. They notice emotional rhythm. They notice consistency. They notice whether interaction feels predictable or unstable. And slowly, their system begins to build trust again. But this trust is not emotional yet. It is behavioral. They are not trusting feelings, they are trusting patterns. And patterns are what convince them that returning might not lead to the same discomfort as before. This is also where emotional memory starts to change its role. Earlier, memory was passive. It surfaced in fragments. It created curiosity. Now it becomes comparative. They begin comparing past emotional pressure with current emotional calmness. And this comparison is powerful because the brain naturally prefers experiences that feel less threatening. So when current interaction feels easier than past emotional intensity, something begins to open internally. Not fully, but enough to continue engaging. At this stage, they do not rush. They test again, and then pause, and then test once more. This slow repetition is their way of ensuring emotional safety is not temporary, because for them, one moment of comfort is not enough. They need consistency, and consistency is what reduces emotional defense over time. As this continues, something subtle happens inside them. The idea of connection stops feeling like pressure. It starts feeling like possibility. And that is a major shift, because earlier, connection and discomfort were linked together. Now they are slowly being separated. And once separation begins, emotional openness becomes more likely. However, even at this point, fear does not vanish completely. It remains in the background. It still influences hesitation. It still affects timing, but it no longer dominates every decision. And this is where emotional balance begins to form. This balance is fragile at first, because one wrong emotional trigger can activate withdrawal again. But if the environment stays steady, something deeper develops. A sense of emotional predictability. And predictability is what makes long-term connection possible for them, because unpredictability is what originally caused them to retreat. So now their internal focus shifts toward evaluating sustainability, not intensity, not excitement, but sustainability of emotional experience. They start asking themselves internally whether this connection can exist without overwhelming pressure, whether it can remain steady without emotional instability, whether it can feel safe without constant emotional demand. And if the answers begin to feel positive, even slightly, attachment starts to return in a more grounded form. This is no longer curiosity alone. It becomes emotional re-engagement, but still controlled, still careful, still measured. They do not jump back into full connection immediately. Instead, they increase interaction gradually. They extend presence slowly. They allow themselves to stay a little longer each time, and with each extension, emotional tolerance grows until eventually, being present no longer feels like risk. It feels natural again, and this is where the real turning point happens, because once presence becomes comfortable, avoidance loses its purpose. There is no longer a need to escape. There is no longer a need to protect against emotional closeness. And what replaces it is something much more stable, a willingness to stay without pressure. But this stability does not come from words or promises. It comes from repeated emotional safety experiences. And once that foundation is strong enough, something very rare begins to happen. They stop questioning whether to stay and start experiencing what it feels like to stay without fear. This is the final shift before real emotional commitment can exist. And everything that follows depends entirely on whether that safety continues or breaks again. What actually determines whether someone stays after coming back or slowly disappears again without warning, because returning is never the final step. It is only the beginning of a much more delicate phase. At this point, emotional contact has already been re-established. The distance is no longer absolute, the silence is no longer permanent. But what happens next is where most connections either stabilize or collapse again. This stage is not about reunion, it is about emotional sustainability. And sustainability is tested through experience, not intention. Even after re engaging, there is still a quiet internal scanning process happening. Every interaction is being measured, not consciously, but automatically. The mind is constantly checking whether emotional exposure feels manageable or overwhelming. This is where consistency becomes more important than intensity. Because intensity can feel exciting, but it can also recreate emotional pressure, and pressure is what originally triggered withdrawal behavior. So, now the system becomes highly sensitive to emotional signals that resemble past discomfort, not because the past is forgotten, but because it is still being used as a reference point. This is why even small emotional fluctuations can have a strong impact at this stage. A calm interaction strengthens trust. A reactive interaction weakens it. A patient response builds stability. A demanding tone increases internal resistance. And over time, these micro experiences accumulate into something significant. They either reinforce emotional safety or slowly rebuild emotional caution. But unlike earlier stages, the response is no longer immediate disappearance. It is gradual adjustment. This is a key shift because earlier discomfort led to full withdrawal. Now discomfort leads to hesitation, and hesitation leads to evaluation instead of escape. This evaluation process becomes more detailed over time. They start noticing emotional patterns that were not visible before. They observe how interactions feel across different moments, not just isolated ones. They begin comparing emotional stability across time rather than single experiences. And this comparison creates clarity. Not emotional clarity, but behavioral clarity. They start understanding whether the connection is predictable or unpredictable, whether it feels grounded or unstable, whether it allows space or demands constant emotional output. And this understanding is what determines their level of comfort moving forward. At this stage, emotional attachment is still fragile. It exists, but it is not fully secure. It can grow or it can shrink depending on ongoing experiences. That is why consistency matters so much here. Because consistency creates psychological safety through repetition, and repetition reduces internal alert signals. When nothing feels unpredictable anymore, the mind stops preparing for emotional escape. Instead, it begins to relax into presence, and presence is the foundation of staying. But even in this phase, there is still an internal duality. One part of them is becoming more open to connection. Another part still remembers emotional overwhelm from the past. This internal split does not disappear quickly. It fades gradually through repeated safe experiences, and every positive interaction slightly shifts the balance. Not dramatically, but steadily, until eventually one side becomes stronger than the other. And when emotional safety outweighs emotional fear, behavior begins to stabilize. At this point, their actions become more consistent. Communication becomes less unpredictable. Engagement becomes more natural, and emotional distance no longer feels necessary for regulation. But this does not mean full emotional surrender has happened. It means emotional defense is no longer active by default. There is still awareness, there is still caution, but it is no longer controlling every decision. This is where true emotional bonding begins to form, not through intensity, but through emotional repetition without disruption. However, there is still one critical factor that determines whether this stability continues or collapses, and that is emotional response under pressure. Because even after progress, one emotionally charged moment can still activate old protective patterns. If emotional space suddenly feels restricted again, the system can revert to distancing behavior. Not instantly, but gradually. First through reduced communication, then through emotional detachment, and eventually through silence. But if pressure does not return, something very different unfolds. Trust deepens. Not because fear is completely gone, but because it is no longer being triggered regularly. And when fear is not repeatedly activated, emotional openness becomes easier to maintain. At this point, the connection starts shifting from cautious engagement to stable presence. They begin to stay longer without feeling the need to withdraw. They respond without overthinking emotional consequences. They engage without preparing for escape. And slowly, staying starts to feel normal. This is the transformation stage most people aim for, but few understand how to maintain. Because staying is not created by persuasion, it is created by emotional environment, and that environment must remain steady long enough for internal resistance to dissolve naturally. Once that happens, something very important emerges: emotional reliability. And emotional reliability is what replaces fear with comfort. It is what turns hesitation into trust. And it is what makes continued connection feel safe instead of threatening. At this point, the relationship is no longer being tested for survival. It is being experienced for stability. And when stability becomes the dominant emotional pattern, the need to leave disappears. Not because fear is forced away, but because it is no longer necessary. And this is the final transformation stage before long-term emotional presence can truly exist without resistance.